Hello and welcome. I'm Lynn Hayes Freeland, and can you believe it? This is our final day together for Upswell 2020. Let me thank all of you who led the attendees through this morning's yoga and self-care practices that all happened within the last hour. And we all know that we need those kind of activities these days. Now, before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge that I'm joining you once again today from my hometown, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It is also the ancestral home of the Osage and the Shawanaki and the Shawnee people who are still in this area and working to reclaim their land and their traditional practices. Thank you. By now, you are well aware that the content of this event has been to get you, the change makers around the country, better prepared to consider how we can best recover from COVID 19 and embody anti racism as a personal value, as well as a driver in your missions. Now, yesterday, there were so many aha moments throughout the day around topics that were explored and pushed and stretched. We heard from the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who really drove our collective commitment to justice home with his incredible conversation. He called on all of us to come together for a third Reconstruction. He said we need a moral revival, a poor people's campaign that brings all people together. He called on us to resist a one moment mentality and build a movement. Now, before I introduce the first main stage of this day, I also have one more announcement that I want to make. Always have those little housekeeping things that I want to share with you. We do have a very special resource that's available today that I want to make you aware of and hope you'll take advantage of. It's going to be in the exhibit hall. Now, in late September, President Donald Trump signed an executive order on race and gender equity trainings that threaten nonprofit organizations' ability to receive government contracts and grants. So, Independent Sector partnered with its legal counsel, Shepard Mullen, to offer a live office hours today between 12 and 2 to answer your questions on that executive order. So please stop by and check out that new resource. And while you're there, you can stop by and check out all of the other exhibitors as well. That's the only housekeeping thing I have for you at this point. So let's move on to our main stage talk of the day. The next group of national thought leaders will have a provocative discussion today about the current state of our democracy, civil society's role in renewing it, and the challenges and opportunities before us to rebuild our nation's civic infrastructure and reinvent American democracy for the 21st century. Please join me in welcoming Stacy Palmer, editor of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Stephen Heintz, President and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and Marc Morial, CEO of the National Urban League.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. We appreciate it. And welcome to everyone. We're so pleased to have a chance to talk with all of you. I know all of us are looking forward to the next time we can all gather live together. I miss these independent sector gatherings very much and seeing all of you in person. So we look forward to that day. And I want to thank everyone who has arranged this virtual event. It's been fantastic. So thank you very much for all that you've done. We have the small topic today of talking about democracy and what we can do to restore it. Clearly on many of our minds today is the fact that Election Day is just 18 days away at this point. And so that's a big focus of what people are thinking about when it comes to democracy right now. We just posted on our website a great piece from Jeffrey Moore of Independent Sector and Brian Mitchell of Nonprofit Staff Vote, talking about the important role nonprofits of all kinds can play in making sure that workers at every level, at every nonprofit have the chance to vote. It offers many suggestions on things that you can do. I urge you to take a look at it and to think about what it is that you can do to get both your employees and your constituents involved in the voting process, because that's so critical. Who knows better what the role of policy is in shaping our country and carrying out our missions than the people who work at nonprofits? So all we can do to get them to vote is critically important. Though that is our focus right now at this moment, I know on our minds, the concerns about democracy have been with us for a long time and critical to this organization. To prepare for this panel, I went back to look at a past talk, and Stephen Heintz, one of our speakers, declared and warned that democracy was at a very perilous moment. We were very polarized, very partisan, and we really needed to take action, and gave a full-throated effort to do that. That was in 2013. So we're going to talk today about how things have changed, looking at the short term, the medium term, and the long term, and what all of us can do to make our democracy stronger and help us out of these crises. We very much want this to be a conversation, so please use the question function to put your questions in as soon as you have them, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. I think many of you know our speakers. Stephen Heintz is head of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and he's also been very involved in democracy issues over time. And he will talk about some of those things, especially about the role he's played in a very important report that charts out the way that democracy can work, and we'll have some links to those things as well. Marc Morial, I think many of you may know too, as head of the National Urban League, a very big nonprofit. But before he joined the nonprofit world more officially, he was a mayor. He was the mayor of New Orleans and also the head of the United States Coalition of Mayors. So he really knows that perspective of government at the local level, as well as working at state and national levels. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me start by asking a question. What is the state of our democracy now? And since I quoted you from 2013, Stephen, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll have Marc answer that question. How are we doing?
Not really well. But first, before I answer the question more specifically, let me just say how delighted I am to be here, and what an honor it is to appear on a panel with Marc, who is just an exceptional leader. And for me, as a former board chair of independent sector, it is also a special pleasure. I love this organization, and I love the members and the people who make this organization. It has a hugely important role. So, to your question, I guess I would answer with two words. What is the state of our democracy? And the first word is imperiled. I really do think our democracy is facing a very severe set of threats. And the second word I would use is promising, which obviously sounds kind of paradoxical. But, you know, when we see the outpouring of civic energy, especially brought upon by the ongoing brutality against Black Americans, and what that has inspired in all kinds of Americans this year, and a sense that people understand that our democracy is under threat. I think there's also a moment of enormous opportunity. And so I have to confess, I toggle back and forth between despair and optimism. And I just want to get through these 22 days. We have a lot of work to do to actually reinvent American democracy for the kinds of challenges we are facing in this century.
Marc, your view?
I would co-sign, amen, echo, reaffirm everything Stephen has said. And democracy is at a crossroads. I think Stephen accurately characterized it. What we witnessed in 2020 is a reawakening of the channeling of American outrage and enragement. We've seen people fully utilize the responsibilities and the rights contained in the First Amendment in the mass protests that took place after the death of George Floyd, when people of all backgrounds, races, colors, creeds, and religions took to the streets. We see in the early days of this voting cycle, now some 14 to 15 million people who have already exercised their right to the franchise in an environment where there's been an active, well-funded, strategic, multi-level, multi-layered campaign to undermine the entire voting system, from voter suppression to attacks on the post office, to limitations on mail drop boxes, to all sorts of learned yesterday of robocalls being sent to an African-American community and a Latino community indicating that the election had been canceled, or the date had been changed, or that their voting poll had been relocated when it has not, but a pernicious effort that extends all the way to St. Petersburg, Russia, to undermine American democracy, to weaken its structures. So there are players at the highest levels in this country, players at the highest levels in foreign nations, and people working behind shade, cover, working behind the curtain to undermine American democracy. So, but we're at a transformative crossroads because of the human energy that I see, which indicates a determination to be heard at the ballot box in this cycle.
So thank you both for that. And you've raised a whole bunch of issues for us to talk about. But before we get into the real meat of what we need to do, can I ask you both to talk more about the role that nonprofits and foundations should play? I mean, after all, many nonprofit organizations at this moment are dealing with a recession with incredible demands on their services. The health crisis is making it very difficult for organizations to operate with social distancing rules, and we have to take care of people in amazing ways. The racial justice movement captures all of our attention. Climate change is upon us. We've got a lot of work to do. Many of the people in this audience are focused on many things. Why should they also be putting in the work on democracy? Why does that matter in this moment when we've got so many urgent crises? Which one of you wants to start?
I'll go. Because all of the issues you just described, the foundation of our ability to act and proceed and progress on them, the foundation is the democratic system, which gives the people a right to participate and to be heard on decision-making by, quote, our representatives and the leaders of this nation. So the idea is that democracy is foundational. You can't separate it from climate change. You can't separate it from racial justice. You can't separate it from economic inequality. You can't separate it from the role of business versus the role of government. It all plays out within the confines of our democratic institutions and our democratic systems, which are created and protected by the Constitution, who have been, that we've fought over for many years and many decades and many generations. So we can't even think about, otherwise those decisions would be made by autocrats, plutocrats, oligarchs, with the people being spectators, or the people being intimidated, or the people being disempowered. So while we may say, well, is this, I don't think it's a quote unquote separate issue. It's a thread that goes through democracy, a thread that goes through every substantive public policy issue that the third sector, the independent sector, the philanthropic sector may be thinking about. And, you know, the uniqueness of America, observed way back by de Tocqueville, was the presence of this third not-for-profit sector that captures the essence of independent human energy, free association, and the ability to direct truly in the hands of people and institutions. So I think we cannot separate it. And I wouldn't have never imagined 20 years ago that we would be fighting on the level we're fighting today to protect American democracy. Many people thought, haven't we fought those battles? Haven't we expanded the right to vote? Haven't we settled this? Well, we are once again reminded that democracy has to be protected and fought for by each successive generation, and it is never guaranteed.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Stephen?
Hard to add to that because I agree with everything Marc has said. But let me maybe address it from 2 points of view. One, the role of philanthropy in this question, which I think is very important. And then what we as a sector, I think, need to be devoting time, attention, and energy to, and resources. Marc is absolutely right. And Marc had a distinguished career in politics, and I spent 15 years at the front end of my career in politics and government service. And it is through the political process that we ultimately make progress as a society. Everybody contributes in lots of other ways, but ultimately it is through the political process. Reverend Barber yesterday said from the main stage, and I'm quoting here, institutional racism isn't just about injustice or police brutality or even hate. It's about power. And he's absolutely right. And in our society, the distribution of power is ultimately determined through the political process. And I think we now know that power is not evenly distributed at all in our society. It is tilted heavily toward the special interests, the moneyed interests, the corporate sector, the few and not the many, which is not what democracy is really all about. So 2 other points here. One is, given that everything philanthropy cares about, as Marc said, whether it's climate change or education reform or healthcare or arts and culture, all of these things also depend on an inclusive, effective, functioning democracy, which is what we do not have at this moment. So I have made the case, including in the pages of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, thank you, Stacy, that foundations ought to be investing more in work directly associated with strengthening our democracy. And the data shows that over the last decade, American foundations have given less than 2% on an annual basis of their grant making to things, kind of broadly defined as helping to strengthen American democracy. So I really urge all of you in the audience who are in the foundation world or in the giving world to really think about this and to join in the funding of the necessary reforms. And I hope we'll get a chance to talk about some of those reforms, because there's a lot to be done, and there's a lot of opportunity for foundations to support nonprofit organizations who are on the front lines of actually reinventing our democracy for the kinds of conditions we face in the 21st century.
Great. And one of those points you made in the piece was that democracy is actually really important. It's proven to things like health. I mean, there's scientific proof behind it. I wonder if you could explain that, because I think sometimes we all think of democracy as being an important and a good thing, and we can all talk about it. But you made the point that really a strong democracy is what makes the difference in whether we truly have good physical health.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. I think ultimately what a lot of the science demonstrates, both social science and hard science, is that democracy is the ultimate public good. That it is the most important way of assuring the vitality of society itself and the vitality of the individuals who make up the society. It has health correlations, it has happiness correlations, It has productivity correlations, and it is really fundamental to a vibrant, caring, compassionate, empathetic society. And when we erode democracy, we actually erode the quality of our society.
And I do want to get to the solutions piece that you just mentioned before too. So we will get there, but I want to talk a little bit about the divisions in our society and what is causing them, because I think that's part of why it's so hard to get our democracy to work well. And I wonder if both of you could give your perspectives on this great divide. Is it worse than it's ever been, or are we just feeling that? And what is it that nonprofits and philanthropy can do to close some of these divides?
You know, I think that race is at the heart of the divide. I think the anxiety about demographic shifts in the country, and therefore an ethos of power sharing is at the heart of it, because the elevation of the division, in my mind, occurred post the election of Barack Obama, which was a high point in American history because of the way in which it represented a historic marker for this country. And Barack Obama built a powerful coalition, won a fairly decisive victory in 2008, but was met by the active creation of what was then called the Tea Party. It was an effort to really animate the farthest right-wing forces in this country. It was designed to create fear. It was central to it was the use of terms like socialist, the whole ethos of otherism, and it was a well-funded, well-organized grassroots campaign that animated from the right. I think that that campaign, not to get political, but to call it like I see it, created the ability of a Donald Trump to normalize and embrace some of those kinds of thinking which mainstream political leaders on the right and the left had always disavowed, and always to some extent disavowed these sort of fringe elements in American politics. Whereas with the rise of Trump and the embrace of birtherism was an effort to normalize, legitimize, amplify, and elevate that. And I think that anxiety is at the heart of it. I think the truth is that the growing divide on an economic level, which has two dimensions, the divide between the very well off and the rest, and the divide between Black people, Latinos, and whites, which is another dimension of the economic divide, is a second element of it. I think these two factors, and then I would add to that lots of anxiety about technology, a lot of excitement about it, but its prospect for leaving people behind, and also a lot of anxiety and tension around globalization, which is economic restructuring, jobs going away. These things, I think, it's almost like a cauldron in a boiling pot, have stoked the division that we see in our country. And I think, last comment I'll make, one of the things that makes division promotes division is we've set up our federal legislative body, the Congress of the United States, with what I call a winner-take-all process. So people run by party. If your party gets just over 51% of the seats, you basically control everything. You control everything. You control the staff, you control the pace of it. That's a structural sort of system that we created. I served in a legislative body in the 90s in Louisiana that wasn't organized on party lines. So it was a nonpartisan body, and you had Republicans and you had Democrats and you had liberals and you had conservatives and you had factions. The factions tended to be regional factions, sometimes ideological, but it was much more of a floating set of issues. You know, there was lots of coalitions that would come together for this issue and then fight over the next issue. It was less of this sort of disciplined kind of system that you have at the national level. And I just wonder if structures like that, structures like the Electoral College, the way in which money has infiltrated in politics, if a combination of all of these things are always going to be a hedge against a more unified approach. I just wonder if some of it is not. It's the levers of power and how we've set up the levers of power have something to do. They're not going to solve it, but whether they exacerbate the divisions is a question I have, and I think it should be on the table for American public debate. And I think the nonprofit world, philanthropy, has to encourage those sorts of discussions to be had in a step away from the political process, where the people discussing it may not necessarily have so much of a direct stake in the outcome of these discussions. Those are some thoughts I have.
And I want to underscore that important role that nonprofits and foundations do play, in part because you have to stay out of real partisan politics.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, all of you are the ones who can bring these issues up without it seeming necessarily, shall we say, self-interested or partisan. So I'm really glad you put that challenge on the table. Stephen, what would you say?
Well, first I want to say that, we are at a moment of kind of acute crisis, but this is not a recent crisis. I mean, you, Stacy, kindly quoted something I said about this in 2013, and I would actually say that the origins of the current democracy crisis in America really go back to the 1970s, and they are in many ways the result of conscious public policy decisions that certain political leaders wanted to change the power dynamics of our country, and they went about a systematic process of doing it, and weakening institutions along the way. Unfortunately, I mean, I think that it was a cynical and dangerous set of policies that weakened the Congress, advantaged the wealthy, advantaged corporate interests, disadvantaged the poor, disadvantaged the citizen more broadly, disadvantaged our environment, our healthcare system. And all of these things contributed to the growing loss of faith in American democracy. And I think this is a critical point. You know, we think of democracy as a system of institutions and processes, but it is also a matter of faith. And John Dewey actually said that democracy was a civic faith. And as one of my colleagues says, democracy works to the extent that we believe democracy works. And Americans right now don't really believe that democracy works because, in fact, it isn't. And so, to me, the crisis has been one that has been, evolving over time, but we're now at a point where it is really acute, and it is, I hope, a hinge moment where we can push the hinge forward and have the kind of reinvention that we need. Dr. Barber also said, I think yesterday, and maybe Lynn quoted him this morning, about a third Reconstruction. I think that's a very useful way of thinking about this. There's another one that I think of as well, which is actually a fourth founding of American constitutional democracy. If you think about it, we've had three: the original, when the Constitution was adopted in 1787. We had the second in the Reconstruction and the constitutional amendments that were adopted during Reconstruction. And we had the third as a result of the civil rights movement in the 60s. And it's time for a fourth founding. And it's interesting, each one of the foundings race has been central. Race was there, as we know, in the beginning. It was the sinful compromise that that was there at the creation of our constitutional democracy. Race was clearly the focus of the second founding during Reconstruction. Race was, and that was, 1 century later. 18th century, 19th century, and in the 20th century, race was the focus again in the civil rights movement. And here we are in the 21st century, needing this fourth founding where race absolutely is central once more. So we, I really do feel like we're on the edge of something actually quite extraordinary, and that we all as American citizens have the opportunity to participate in the fourth founding. What a remarkable thing that is, but we have to make it happen.
And that can sound like a very hard thing to achieve, although incredibly important. So I'm going to take audience questions in a second, but I was curious if each of you had one thing that you thought the people in the audience could act on. What would be the one thing, and you each get one, so we'll have two takeaways of things that people could do and start right now. What would be some of your first steps? And we'll come back to this later in the conversation if we have time, but I can see we have a number of audience questions, so I do want to get to them. So what is critical? Marc, do you want to start?
So much is critical.
I know, it's hard to choose one, so I apologize for the question, but let me.
The only thing I have on my mind right now is people must vote and ensure that their vote counts. And if you have voted, it's powerful, then spend the next 2.5 weeks encouraging others to do so. And keep your eye out for voter suppression, keep your eye out for games that are played, and report them to the hotline that we're part of at 1-866-OUR-VOTE. I just think right now, right in front of us, it's so important. We started this year at the National Urban League encouraging everyone that this year was going to be about voting and being counted in the census. Two very important fundamentals of American democracy and civic participation. And then COVID hit. And then there was George Floyd. So we've expanded our focus this year. It started with a narrow focus on we're going to continue to do our work, and we're going to elevate these two things. So I think right now, I think it's a worthwhile discussion after November the 3rd, when we'll have an idea of what the landscape of the country looks like, where are the opportunities, where are the fears, where the structure to really, return to the discussion I think Stephen identified, which is this entire effort now for 50 years to restructure the levels of the levers of power in American democracy. And I've been reflecting a lot on the 1980 election. I was a first-year law student that year, and how dramatic and profound the shifts that occurred in 1980 were. And then thinking, my goodness, is that 40 years ago? Can't believe it's been that long. And thinking about all along the way, the public policy battles and fights and issues, Supreme Court decisions and things that have happened along the way. So I think this is a vote today, but let's continue this conversation after November the 3rd.
Absolutely. So we're going to come back and hold you to that. Stephen, what would you say is the one most important thing?
Yeah, well, I'll pick up right where Marc left off. Obviously, I fully endorse the need for all of us to participate in this election, but then we need to go to work. And we need to go to work to actually accomplish the reinvention of our democracy, the kinds of fundamental reforms that are necessary so that it works better. I don't know where that is coming from, but I'm hearing some background noise.
Yes.
Okay. I want to just draw everybody's attention to this report. I don't know if people can see it. It's called Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. And I think it's available in the links and so forth. But this is a report that came from a national commission organized by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which was founded in 1780 to be of service to the nation. And 35 of us, I had the privilege to co-chair the commission, 35 extraordinary and very diverse Americans from all sectors and all parts of the country, and both parties and all political ideologies worked together for 2 years. And this report lays out 31 very specific recommendations that we believe would constitute the core of the fourth founding of American democracy that we need. And I would encourage, I hope everybody in this audience will download this report. It's available through the links, and organize around it. Because what we want to see now is not just a good report, which I think this is, but a campaign over the next few years to actually implement these 31 recommendations, which would restore so much of what is out of balance in our democracy today. And it has recommendations not only about political reform, but also about the importance of civil society and the nonprofit sector and our civic culture and the influence of social media, et cetera. So we need to go to work after we vote, because voting is only one step in a long process that we need to undertake. And I hope people will give some attention to the work that is suggested in this report.
Great. Okay, so now all of us know at least some first steps we need to take. I'm going to take the audience questions now. If you have more questions, please go ahead and put them in the question function, and we'll try to get to them. The first question is, it's many parts, but one of the key things that we haven't talked about yet is, how can women of color have a voice that speaks to the volume of their worth in rebuilding this democracy? Who wants to take that first?
Well, I'll just start by saying women of color have been the backbone in many ways of our democracy and of our civil society. When you look across this country, so many of the essential nonprofit organizations are run by women of color. They're the activists, they're the organizers, they're the people who get stuff done. And you know, the history of progress in this country would not be what it has been without the hard work, the under-acknowledged, underappreciated hard work of millions of women of color who have believed and worked and tried to make those beliefs available for the next generation. So we need to honor them, we need to support them, we need to learn from them.
Mark?
Mark, you're muted.
I didn't want you to hear my teenage son talking to me. Women of color, and I co-sign what Stephen said, have emerged as the most active, the most participatory voters in the United States. Women of color turn out at higher levels than any other demographic group. And there's now this incredible energy around women of color running for public office. Obviously, we see a woman of color on the vice presidential ticket, which is a historic undertaking. I think that women of color will advocate for themselves, but I think we all have to be allies, because they've faced the twin, if you will, barriers of both gender and race historically, in the workplace, in overall society, and also in the political spectrum. And women of color are now knocking on the door and knocking the door down, which I wholeheartedly embrace. I wholeheartedly affirm and consider myself an ally of that, because to the extent that it occurs, the nation is better, society is better, our democracy is stronger.
The next question is specifically for you, Stephen, because it talks about the role of philanthropy very specifically. But Mark, I welcome your answer on this as well. Stephen, how do you see the power held by philanthropy itself as relevant or problematic in our democracy?
It's both. It's both relevant and problematic. We have to acknowledge from the outset that philanthropy exists because of economic inequality. You know, we wouldn't have these endowments if there hadn't been huge wealth generation, wealth creation. And in many cases, that wealth generation was actually accomplished through harm to others and harm to nature. I represent an organization that is a perfect example. The Rockefeller Wealth, of course, was generated by John D. Rockefeller in the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century. He was the wealthiest man in the world shortly after the turn of the century, and his wealth was actually, as a percentage of the economy, bigger than Bill Gates's is today, and it was all through the oil industry. And so, massive inequality, and something that we ultimately learned was damaging our very planet. So we have to acknowledge in philanthropy that we have a massive debt to society. We are in a very privileged and powerful position. We need to acknowledge that as we are dealing with our grantees and do everything we can to try to readjust the power imbalance. And we have a moral obligation, I think, to use the wealth that was generated for social good. And I think it is absolutely an imperative. We have in philanthropy anti-democratic roots, which for me is a moral challenge to use our resources to support democratic process and democratic outcomes. So it's a really important problem. And just the way that we acknowledge the Native Americans on whose soil we are, we need to acknowledge the power and privilege and inequality that is at the heart of foundation endowments.
Thank you.
Let me
Marc, did you
offer
want to
that.
comment on that?
Yeah, I'd offer that. I think the opportunity for American philanthropy is to be more intentional about supporting what Reverend Barber talked about, and that is the need to, and I embrace this idea that we need not a moment, but a movement. And I think American philanthropy, through its energy and its financial support, can support those that are on the front lines. Many of them are organizations led by people of color who've been in the trenches and in the vineyards and candidly underfunded, under-resourced for many, 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 many generations, but who have, I think, the moral bully pulpit, number one, the level of expertise. Many of my colleagues now who lead historic civil rights organizations, I'll call it, are incredibly well-educated, highly qualified people who could be highly successful in the private sector, highly successful in the public sector, who've chosen this work because it's consistent with their life's purpose. And they want to put their talent to use. But historically, while all of us have had success raising money, we've never had the kind of success that the problem we seek to address really, really calls for. And I think philanthropy, American philanthropy, it is an opportunity for American philanthropy to do a reexamination and think anew about how more emphasis, more intention, more support can be placed on that, because we have a tremendous, just if you look at the income inequality question alone, which is all about distribution of wealth and therefore distribution of power, and you compare where we are in America today to where we were in 1975, it's a dramatic change, a dramatic divide, a dramatic shift. And in between that, there's all of the other issues of power dynamics, racial dynamics, some regional dynamics that are in play. So I think there's such an important time for American philanthropy to take a step back and say, not to self-indict, but to course correct in this moment to be on the tip of the spear, to be foundational, to be extremely intentional about addressing many of the issues that we're talking about today. So it's a conversation I welcome. It's been an interesting experience for us over the last 120 days or so, 150 days, to be in a lot more conversations than we've historically been in with people who want to support racial justice work, economic justice work, educational equity work, closing health disparities work. So it's been encouraging, but we all sit back and look at ourselves and say, is this going to be just this moment? And then back 12 months from now, everything moves back in the same old direction. As people who are interested in the building of a better nation, building of a reformed America, building of an America for the 21st century, we can't allow that to happen.
Stacey, could I add just two quick, I know we want to get some others, but Marc has inspired me to think of two other things. Just, I would urge the foundations in the audience and foundations more broadly to do two things in this period. One is increase your willingness to take risk, and second, fund the movements. Fund the movements, because we know from history that the real change we need in this country will not come from above. It is going to come from the bottom up. It's going to come from the people who are on the streets protesting, exercising their rights to speak, asking for change, demanding change, and organizing. And they need support. And so I would say, be willing to take more risk and fund the movements.
And certainly so many of the movements that we have seen succeed are because philanthropy did decide to invest. So I think it's a really important point. We've been talking a lot about the foundation and giving side right now, and another audience member has a different question, is what are some of the sector specific challenges or pitfalls you've experienced in advancing our democracy? How can we avoid these? So I just think the speaker probably wants to know, if you're in education or arts or healthcare or other kinds of things, are there things that you've seen that are either helpful or not helpful in terms of thinking about democracy work?
Well, let me take a stab at it. I really do think that the nonprofit sector, which is, probably the core of what we think of as civil society, is the place where democracy is nurtured and supported. Because the nonprofit sector, civil society more broadly, these are the places where citizens actually come together to contribute to the common good. And they do it because they see a need, they want to contribute to a solution. They want to solve a problem. They want to work with their neighbors. They want to work with their community. And this is where democratic culture and civic faith are really nurtured. And I think we have just extraordinary stories all across this country, and of people in civil society, in nonprofit organizations doing remarkable work. And it's always a struggle to get funding to support the things that they're doing. So one really important thing that I know IS is working on, and it is also related to one of the recommendations in our Common Purpose report, is that we believe there should be a new national trust for civic infrastructure, which would be a funding pool, a national funding pool, managed in a way to support very local community building activities, building of civic faith, building of common good across lines of difference, whether it's race or economic or religion. And that is so important that we think it deserves a kind of a national approach with very localized distribution of funds with partners. It's kind of ironic. The Congress appropriates something like $200 or $300 million a year to a national endowment for democracy, but it is only permitted to work outside the United States. And essentially, we need an endowment for American democracy to support the extraordinary civic work that is occurring all across this country as a way of strengthening civil society's role in protecting and being the guardians of our democracy.
And Marc, I know you're working specifically on some efforts to build the civic infrastructure. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
So I'll say, I think Stephen's exhortation to fund the movement and fund the work of organizing the movement is a recognition that social movements move the needle in American life. The Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, these are social movements of these times. March for Our Lives of young people who responded to gun violence. These are social movements that help educate the public and help move the needle on public opinion, and thereby affect voting and democracy and civic participation. So I think that is a very important thing. We have seen in this cycle, we have a nonpartisan civic engagement initiative that we're running now called Reclaim Your Vote. It's been refreshing. We have organizers in 19 places in 6 states. And then we have other activities in another 70 locations. And that energy, which is really about talking to people about the value of democracy and the value of participation, that energy and that system that we built would go away after November 3rd for lack of funding, or it would remain activated in an effort to work on policy change, issues, and the like. Sometimes grassroots activations and community-based activations and people-to-people activations are too seasonal and temporary in their existence when they need to be permanent in their existence in an effort to continue the conversation and the discussion at the grassroots level. I'll tell a story because I think it's an important story about civic participation. Everyone knows I'm from New Orleans. In the 1960s, my mother and her friends sought to join the League of Women Voters in New Orleans in 1962, 63, and they were not allowed to join because they were African-American women. What did they do? They went out and they created their own organization called the Louisiana League of Good Government, which was an organization similar to the League of Women Voters, which worked on civic participation amongst African-American women. My mother was the first founding president of the organization. And I remember as a boy going to voter registration drives, rallies. They did a lot of work after the passage of the Voting Rights Act to do democracy engagement and civic engagement in classes and seminars and workshops to help people understand the system of voting. It's organizations like that, in addition to the newer or movement-based organizations, that need to be more robust, that need to be supported to a greater extent so that they can continue to do this real grassroots work of democracy building. And there's no one, this is not a superstructure. This is an industry or, if you will, multiple saplings and seedlings all over the nation. And we're the National Urban League, but what we really are is a network of 90 local community-based groups. It's fundamentally what we are. We're a network more than we're some sort of singular enterprise. And I think that's what's called for now, for us to recognize that we need that. And it has to go beyond conversations on social media. Very important, but not enough.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, our time for this conversation has drawn to a close, which I apologize for because there's so much more to talk about. You have both given us so much food for thought and actual action steps that I think we can all work on. So I thank you for that.
Hey, I appreciate you.
So I'm going to do a applause that I would do if we were in person on behalf of all of us in the audience. I want to thank you both for a really insightful conversation. For all of you in the audience, thank you for attending, and I hope that the rest of the conference goes very well for you. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you,
Thanks,
Stacy.
Stephen.
Mark,
Bye now.
Mark, great to be with you, man.
Yeah, great to be with you. We'll catch up.